All right, looks like everybody who's in the waiting room is here. So, my name is Sophia Gibbery. I'm not sure if I've had a chance to meet all of you, but I'm the director of Upward Bound. And today we have with us back Julia from, she's a success coach. She works on the campus of Binghamton University. And she's going to talk to us today a little bit about test stress and how to be successful in studying and test taking. So if you have any questions throughout, put them in the chat, and we'll see if Julia can get to them throughout the presentation. But if not, she'll definitely answer all of your questions at the end. And with that, I will give it to you, Julia.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So as Sophia mentioned, so my name is Julia Milewski, and I am a success coach at Binghamton University. So we are going to talk about today all about really studying and test taking strategies. So I've broken it up into 5 different tips that you can start practicing in your everyday life as a student. Before then, though, I always like to get to know people. And as Sophia mentioned, I like to use the chat, the chat function in any presentation I give on Zoom now, just as a way to stay engaged. So a couple times throughout the presentation, I will ask you to, if you're able to, just, respond in the chat to some questions or give feedback, thoughts. If you have questions at any point, I will try my best to pause at the end of each slide, address any questions in the chat, and then we'll keep going from there. And we will keep going. All right, and I see one thing in the chat. Absolutely, if you can only stay for 15 minutes, I'm from my end. I welcome any and all, engagement at any point. So thank you for sharing, though. All right. So first and foremost, most things in life for me surround like food, ice cream, pizza, anything like that. So I would like to actually hear from all of you, just to get to know the room, your name, and your favorite pizza topping. So in the chat box, if you don't mind just putting in your name and your favorite pizza topping. If you don't like pizza, that is okay. And you can just put in your favorite food or alternative to pizza. And this is a judgment-free zone. So Sophia and I were just talking before our preferences on pizza, but just curious to see. I'm an Endicott gal. I'm originally from Endicott. And so I definitely have some like chicken wing pizza, specifically from Rossi's. That's, in my opinion, probably the best pizza topping in this area, but my mind can be changed. So let's see. Awesome. Oh, yes. You guys were quick with this. Thank you. So mushrooms and bacon. I like that. Okay. Ham and pineapple. Another pineapple. All right. I know that's a controversial answer, but like I said, no judgments here. Breakfast pizza. Yep. Just a plain slice. Absolutely. Classic pepperoni. Olives. Oof. Yes. I see another Rossi person. Yes. Brianna. Yes. Rossi's pizza, my opinion, one of the best here. Extra cheese. Oh, Destiny. Yes. Extra cheese. I'm also a fan of. Cheese. Chicken wing pizza. Yes. Okay. Chicken bacon ranch from Rossi's. Yes, absolutely. Onions. Absolutely. Oh, gosh. See, now I just want pizza. But the reason I do this is, one thing, food is universal, especially pizza, especially in this area. There's always some hot topics on food or on pizza itself. So I think that's a nice way to kind of get to know the crowd. And also now you all know each other's favorite pizza toppings. So this is a nice way to, if somebody has your favorite or you're willing to try somebody else's favorite, you can always do like a COVID safe friendship date and get some pizza. Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing that. Even though I could probably give a TED Talk on pizza itself, my love for it, how to make it, all of that, we're actually here to talk about success and student success. So I'm going to dive into some of this, but we can always come back to pizza at the end if we need. Okay. All righty. So what we're going to cover today are 5 tips to for less test stress. Okay. So some people call it test anxiety. Some people call it just test stress, or just test taking in general. So we're going to talk about 5 tips on how to have less stress around test time. Okay, so we're going to talk about the study environment. We will talk about some study strategies, some test taking strategies. We'll talk about test stress and kind of what that means and how to cope with it, what to do if you have lots of stress around test taking. And then also just asking for help and how to go about doing that. All right. So we will dive on in. Before I do this though, I actually want to just set the tone. So with any type of success topic, I always like to share that the goal is not for you to walk away being like, Julia shared the secrets to life, right? Because each one of us are going to have different strengths, preferences, different strategies that work for different people. So any of the things that we talk about today, strictly meant for just broadening your perspectives. So these are ideas you can think about, talk to friends about, say, hey, I went to this upward bound presentation and, the presenter mentioned this strategy. Have you ever tried it? Talking about these things with friends, family, coaches, teachers, whomever it might be, tutors, that can really kind of just start the conversation to allow you to develop these skills further. All right. So this is just the beginning of the conversations that I hope that you all continue to have with those support systems that you have as well. All right. So before that, or after that, we'll dive into study environment. So in the chat box, I actually want to hear from you all. So take a minute to think about and share, what is your ideal study environment? So if you have to sit down and do an assignment or, study for a test, what is your ideal environment? So where are you? What is the noise level around you? Do you need it completely silent? Can you have some background noise? Do you like to have music on in the background? Are there people there? So do you like to study with other people or be able to kind of talk through some things? Or do you have to be completely alone? All right. No one around and soft music on? Absolutely. Yeah. Quiet or depending on the test music. Okay. Yep. We have a second for the no one around, soft music on. No one else around, music in the background. Yeah. You work better in the dark. That's awesome. Okay. Very interesting, Sarah. Thank you for sharing that. Just by myself, music. Yeah. So there's definitely varying study environments depending on what task you're completing, right? So if you're studying for math, maybe you need a different environment than what you're studying for or trying to write a paper or studying for an English exam. So it's really dependent on just identifying that the environment that you are studying in might need to change based on what it is that you are studying. And thinking about that noise level around you. So I know some of you have said your preferences are completely quiet. Others of you have said, a little bit of background music or, just like white noise or like background noise, but not something like not anything that's too distracting. So that's really important to start to think about before you study or before you sit down for a big exam or a big assignment. Where is the environment that you're sitting down in? And what type of environments do you have accessible to you? So one thing I always like to point out to students is, is there a library space that you have access to? I know right now with COVID, it's a little bit strange depending on if you're in person or not in person, or, if your schedule kind of matches up, if you can study, at night or during the day or whatever it might be, but really thinking about what is that best environment for you and how can you recreate to the best of your ability that ideal study environment. Okay. So other things that go into this, and thank you all for sharing, because it's always helpful to see all of the different environments that exist, because there's really no one secret sauce environment that it's going to work for everybody. So when you're thinking about your ideal study environment, you always want to think about what are your most common distractions and how can you lessen the distraction, right? So a lot of times students I work with, and again, I work primarily with college students, but I think this goes across the board because I find this to be my biggest distraction is my phone. So usually our technology around us, our phone, maybe it's our family or friends. If you are like in a study hall or at home and your family is hilarious, or maybe they're annoying or whatever it is, or your friends are hilarious or annoying and they're taking your distraction away, or your attention away and distracting you, it's actually important to think about, what is my biggest deterrent to me getting my work done right now? And is there a way for me to, remove myself from the environment or create the environment that is going to be best for my studying? Okay. So really just identifying those common distractions even before you go to sit down, so you can plan for that ideal study environment. The second thing is going to be identifying a workstation checklist. And I know it's like, Julia, workstation checklist, that sounds really cheesy. I'm a very cheesy person, so just bear with me. But I do like to say, have a workstation checklist. So that can be any place that you're doing work. If you have a desk, if you do work on your bed, on your floor, wherever it is, consider that your workstation. And think about, what do you need within arm's reach, right? So that you don't have to get up once you start doing whatever task you're going to do. So whether you're studying, writing a paper, doing a big assignment. So I always encourage students to think about that checklist. So if you need any technology, so laptops or tablets, or your phone, any chargers for those, those pieces of technology, your notebooks, pens or pencils, of course, your textbooks. And then I always like to say, think about too your needs as a human. So are you going to need a drink? Are you going to, coffee, water, tea, whatever your drink of preference is, have that close by. Are you going to need a snack? Have a snack close by, so that way you don't get distracted if you have to get up and, go into the kitchen or go to the cafeteria, wherever it is, and, grab a snack quick. That way you can just have everything set out that you're going to need for that study session or that work session. Okay. And so I will pose this question. You don't have to share in the chat, but I will pose it, and I hope that you think a little bit more on it kind of as we move forward. And then after today as well, is what changes can you make to your current study environment to optimize the time that you do have when studying? Okay, so how can you lessen those distractions? How can you plan to have, that ideal environment? Is it making a study playlist? Maybe you have a good one on Spotify, or Pandora or YouTube, whatever type of music streaming service you use. Or maybe you're like me and you still use CDs. I don't know, but maybe you have a good mix that you like to use. And thinking about, okay, do I have everything set so that way I can really focus in and get some work done? Okay, so that's the first one. All right, so thinking about your study environment and thinking about it ahead of time is going to be key. The second one is going to be study strategies. So thinking about those study strategies and really planning as to what study strategies you're going to use. So we're actually on the next slide going to talk about making a study plan. But this slide, I just want to talk about, kind of as an overview, a few different ways that I work with students on planning out your study strategies or approaching studying, okay? And the reason why I have somebody doing jump squats on the slide there, the little image, is because the two examples, massed practice versus spaced practice, and varying methods of application. So those two that are under the planning little topic, those two things are like exercising your memory muscles. So it's like doing mental squats for your mind. Okay, and I'm going to explain why. But if anybody has ever done squats before, you might know, or bicep curls or whatever, any type of working out, you might know that the more you practice it and the more you do it, the stronger you become. So this is the same thing with these two planning strategies. So this idea of massed practice versus spaced practice comes in where massed practice is going to be like if you're cramming for an exam. You're doing everything like a large quantity or a large volume of time all at once before an exam. So this might look like if you procrastinated quite a bit and you pushed things off and now it's the night before an exam and you're like, oh my gosh, I got out of school and now I only have like 3 hours. That's a lot of time too, but maybe 3 hours, I got to cram. I can only focus on this one subject. So if that's the case, we consider that massed practice. Whereas research shows us, so there's a whole bunch of educational research that's done around this topic, and research shows us that it's actually the psychology of our learning and the psychology of our memory, that if you space out your study sessions throughout the week, so have multiple study sessions, that you're actually going to yield greater results. So instead of taking a 3-hour chunk the night before the exam, if you could break that up, let's say just 3 days before the exam, and you study for 1 hour per night, right? And then that way it's going to add up to the total of the 3 hours. But the night before the exam, you only have to spend 1 hour studying because you already studied the previous nights. A lot of times students will say, Julia, that sounds real nice. And I try to do that every time. And then things come up and I end up not doing it. And so I always like to explain that if you make it a priority, that this spaced practice, again, the research tells us that it's actually going to yield greater results. So it will actually allow you to have more success on the exam, because what happens between these study sessions, so let's say you have an exam on Friday, and so you begin studying Tuesday, okay? So you have Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. So when you start studying Tuesday, you study for an hour, you go over the material. So that's day 1, you're good. Wednesday, so you're going to review day 1 a little bit, right? And a little bit of forgetting may have set in, right? So you know what you reviewed, but or you know what you studied yesterday, but you got to look at it again just to remember. So that act of reviewing it, so when you review day 1 on day 2, and then when you go on to day 3, you're going to be reviewing what you covered days 1 and 2, right? And then study day 3. So this act of reviewing is actually like doing the squat. So every time you kind of have to go back and review, you're strengthening your memory recall muscle. And so this is actually going to make it easier that when you're on the exam or in the test, that your memory is going to be that much stronger with that content that you were studying. So I always like to say 3 days before is a great place to start. If you're used to just kind of cramming the night before, or, if you want to get real advanced, start studying 5 days ahead of time. And then you can break it up into even smaller chunks and just really start trying to figure out what works best for you, given each subject that you're studying. Okay, so this is the idea, again, that you want to really optimize that memory muscle and do some of those mental squats for your memory muscle. So that way, when you are, breaking up your study sessions, having those spaced sessions, that you're doing those mental squats. Okay. The second one on the screen is the varying methods of application. So that's just kind of a fancy way of saying you just want to try different or use different study strategies to study the same concept. So what this means is maybe for history, you want to, write out some responses to the review questions in your textbook. So at the end of the chapter, you know that there's review questions, they were optional, they weren't assigned. So you're like, I don't know if I'm going to do them. But for studying, okay, so you're going to answer those review questions. Maybe you'll make flashcards. Do is vary the different approaches depending on the class. So for, like I said, for history, you might be doing, some review questions or maybe English and flashcards and tutoring, or, for math, maybe you're doing practice problems and you're going to be doing flashcards for formulas, or, talking with your teacher about specific concepts that you were having trouble with. So I always like to include, asking for help from your support system, which I have a whole slide dedicated to. But that's also a way that you can have a study strategy, is asking for that support from your support system. So if you're going to tutoring, if you are, talking with your teachers, if you are attending review sessions or whatever it might look like, that is part of your study process, right? It's your preparation. So keeping that in mind. So spacing out the study sessions, really using that strong time management, spacing out those study sessions will build that recall muscle. And then varying the methods of application will also help out too. And so reason is behind that one is because when you're on an exam, it's not just going to ask you for straight definitions all the time. So if you're only studying with flashcards and, the main method of flashcards is usually memorization, and it's maybe you're being asked to, analyze an excerpt from a text and provide an argument or something that you might have to generate some of your own thought and refer back to the text as opposed to just straight memorization. Now, if you know that you've varied your practice and varied your study strategies, you will have prepared for not just memorization, but maybe you prepared, okay, how do I analyze this now? And think about it from those couple different perspectives. Okay, I'm going to pause. If there are questions about those first two, I welcome you to put them in the chat. I am going to start talking about the actual study strategies, and then we can always go back to any of these if you have additional questions. Okay, so the Feynman technique. So this is one that is really interesting. And when I first learned it, I wish I had known about it before. I learned it as a success coach. I wish I knew about it when I was a student. So the Feynman technique is where you are studying a concept or you're studying a topic and you begin to think about, how would I explain this to somebody in elementary school or at the 6th grade level? So you think, how would I explain whatever topic it is? Sometimes it's a little bit more complex. How would I be able to simplify terms and explain it to a little sibling, a niece or nephew, whomever it might be, who's in elementary school, a neighbor, somebody who is going to be at a lower grade level than you are? So how would you explain it to them? And so this technique actually requires you to have a little bit of a deeper understanding about the content itself to be able to simplify it and then explain it. So it's like the same reason why sometimes you might hear people say, if you are tutoring somebody or maybe you hear, like teaching is the best way to learn yourself or things like that. This is the same thought process behind it, is that person might, number one, when you're explaining it to somebody, they might ask you a question because they're hearing it for the first time that you've never thought about before. So if you're not able to answer that question, maybe that's a gap in your knowledge that you then need to go back and review. Or if you're starting to explain it and you're finding, oh, I really actually don't know how to explain it besides like just basically saying exactly what's in the textbook, then that's a nice reminder. Okay, maybe I need to study this a little bit further and think about how I could put these things in my own words and then share it with somebody at a lower level. Okay, so that's one technique that has been proven to be very helpful when you're starting to study for any type of content, any type of test. The next one is making connections to your own life and then summarizing in your own words. And so with these, the first one, the making connections to your own life, I always like to give the example of if it's for, let's say an English class and you're reading a novel, trying to think of the characters like people in your own life. Or if you need to, think about teachers or coaches at your school and kind of associate them with specific characters. Keep them to yourself because sometimes it's not always the best association. But if you know yourself when you're studying things, making connections to people and things that are relevant in your everyday life can actually help you remember things on an exam or on a test. Okay, so I do like to tell students, start to think about, oh yeah, that situation that we learned about in science, like that reminded me of this thing that I saw on TV or this YouTube video or this TikTok video, whatever it is. Thinking about what will make it relevant to you is going to be really important and can help trigger that memory when you're on the test. the next one, I know it's a slash, but summarizing in your own words. So I always like to tell students, whatever's written in the textbook is, yes, that is great. But the point is not to memorize it. Or, if your teacher gives like PowerPoints out, the point is not to memorize these things, because if you do that, that's really, you're memorizing the words of somebody else, right? You're memorizing the words of probably the PhD person, the person with the PhD who wrote the textbook, or your teacher who is creating these slides, but they're not in your own words. So we're more likely to remember things in a high stress test environment if we had summarized in our own words than if we're trying to memorize words that are new to us or foreign to us, or are very like textbook heavy and just very academic. So what I always like to tell students is to read a section of a textbook, look at a PowerPoint or whatever it is that you're studying, and then write a summary in your own words. And that's really going to allow you to begin to process through this information, and it will allow you to recall that information that much easier. Okay, and the last one is going to be self-quizzing. And so these will be, practice problems or flashcards, something that is going to actually test your knowledge. What we want to do is avoid the familiarity trap. And so this is referred to, if you've ever read a textbook and you're trying to study, let's say it's, I'm going to pick on history again. Let's say it's a history textbook and you're reading a passage because you really want to memorize the dates. And so you read the passage 3, 4, 5 times. And by the end of the night, you're like, I got it. Okay, I'm ready. I got it. I can recall these things, no problem. And then you get to the exam and you're like, I have no idea what I read. I read it 5 times, but I can't remember it. And a lot of times that's going to be because we were exposing ourselves to it so many times in repetition that we were actually kind of just getting into this familiarity trap instead of actually quizzing ourselves and seeing, can we produce the information on our own? So with practice problems, that's really good because that's going to actually kind of emulate or simulate what the actual test environment might be like. With flashcards, the trick is to make sure that you're asking yourself to produce the most amount of content. So just having, one word, whether it's a vocabulary word or the name of a content or the name of a concept or something that you're trying to study, that you want to quiz yourself using that one key word, and then you have to see if you can produce the longer explanation or the longer definition. So you really want to begin to kind of challenge yourself there and see how much of that content can you produce on your own, because that's what you'll be asked to do on an exam. Okay. Awesome. I know that I'm kind of going quickly, but again, if you have questions or if there's something that I mentioned that you'd like to hear more about, just pop it in the chat and I'm happy to address. Okay. I'm going to move on to making a study plan. And so this is part of study strategies. This is kind of like 2A. All right. So making a study plan is something that I work a lot with college students on, but it's something that I actually wish that a lot of my students did in high school, because most students that I end up working with, they've never really thought about making a study plan before. So when I talk to students about how you can start to really elevate your approach to test taking and to studying, I usually say the first thing you put on your to-do list or write in your agenda should not be start studying. It should be make a study plan. Okay. And so this is going to allow you to plan ahead. It might only take like 15 minutes, 20 minutes to do, but it's going to set some really powerful intentions or goals that you then have a framework to work with throughout the time that you're going to be studying. So those things include like, when do you plan to begin? What type of tasks will you intend to accomplish each day? In what environment will you be studying? We talked about that at length. Who else needs to be involved? So do you have a tutor that you want to involve in your studying? Do you have a teacher that you need to ask questions? Do you have a group of friends who you know that you're all taking the same exam? Maybe you can study together. And then how will you be taking breaks? And so if you're planning to study, especially in the high school setting, when you have so many different subjects that you're keeping track of, making sure that you're giving yourself time to give yourself a mental break or a mental rest when you're studying is going to be really important. So with this, I want to give a second, and I know it's a little bit hard because we're not in person and we're just all on Zoom, but I want to pause and to encourage you to think about, do you have an upcoming exam or a quiz or maybe a big assignment? All right, and so get that in mind, an upcoming exam, quiz, or assignment. Think about when it is. So when is the due date? When is the exam date? The quiz date? How many days do you have from now until then? And then you can start to ask yourself these questions on the screen. So when do you plan to begin studying? Right, so how many days do you have? And then when do you plan to begin studying? I usually like to say too, you want to make this the ideal study plan, in the sense of if realistically, all right, Julia, so my next exam or my next quiz is Friday, so I want to start studying tonight. Make that your goal. Now, this is not to say that, life happens, right? It's inevitable. Things come up, we get distracted, we have other, responsibilities. Maybe you have to cover a shift at work or whatever it is. So things come up. So we want to make sure that we're making a plan that can remain flexible for life, but also a plan that will give us some structure that we can follow in the days leading up to the exam itself. Okay. All right. So when do you plan to begin? And what type of tasks will you intend to accomplish each day? So if and we just learned, you want to space out your practice, right? That's going to strengthen that memory recall. That's going to allow you to break things down into smaller tasks, which can actually help with motivation. It can help with, our tendencies to procrastinate. I could give a whole TED talk on that though, so I'm not going to dive in too deep, but if you're breaking these larger tasks down into smaller tasks, smaller things that that you can accomplish in a short amount of time, that can be really helpful too. So what specific tasks are you going to be intending to accomplish in that time? Making flashcards, asking for help, chatting with a tutor, organizing a study group, any of those tasks might be included in your plan. Then identifying what environment will you study. So thinking about the topic and then thinking about what is your ideal environment for studying that specific topic. Who else needs to be involved? Again, thinking about, do I need to go to extra help in the morning or at, after school, whatever it might look like. Is this something that I could be looking at resources online for? So are there YouTube videos, tutorial videos, or things like that you could be looking up to see? So really thinking about who else needs to be involved, and then how will you be taking breaks? So it is inevitable. We might feel stress. We're going to talk about stress on the next slide actually, but you might be feeling stressed out about the studying process. And so building in breaks can be a nice reward system. So when you are studying, if you study for a solid hour, you give yourself a 20-minute break or whatever it might be. So allowing yourself that mental time to really rest, especially with Zoom. I think we've all experienced this Zoom fatigue. It's very real. And so thinking about, okay, how can I be building this rest in? And so there's a bunch of research out there that tells us that the neurotypical person, usually we begin to lose focus on a task between 50 minutes and about an hour and a half. So losing focus doesn't mean like you get a text message, you look at the text message, you answer it, and then you go back to your work. Losing focus is when you hit a wall, right? So you're trying to do the task, you're trying to study, you're trying to read a textbook, and you just cannot move forward from it. So you are like thinking about, I don't know what's for dinner, or thinking about the most random things because your mind is just not focusing anymore. And so that is what I mean by losing focus. And so it's that sustained focus. You're just not able to keep it sustained anymore. That's when you need that mental break. Walk away from your computer, your textbook, whatever it is, for 10 minutes, set a timer, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, make yourself a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, listen to your favorite playlist. I usually tell students to make a study break playlist. You can curate like 8 minutes of your absolute favorite songs, put in your earbuds, like AirPods, whatever they are, I don't know, put in your earphones and dance around, or just like kick your feet up and listen to your favorite 8 minutes of music. That's a really nice way too, just to kind of decompress before going back into studying as well. Okay. Awesome. We're making our way through, guys. We are on slide or tip number 3 out of 5. Okay. So test stress. So I actually want to hear from you all. What are some common reasons you might feel test stress or test anxiety? And what are some common forms of it? So are there certain reasons? Like, are there specific things, like you're nervous that you're not going to be prepared enough, or you don't know what's going to be on, or something like that? And then forms of test stress might be like you're not sleeping well, or you're procrastinating, or examples like that. So can you all think of any? And if so, please put them in the chat. Any, reasons for test stress? Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. So feeling like I'm going to get a really low grade. Yeah. So that kind of that fear and that stress of like, I don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. Yeah. Anybody else? Other reasons? Yeah. Yep. Feeling unprepared. Absolutely. Not feeling comfortable or confident in your knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. The AP exam can determine if get that. If that is not pressure enough, yes, that pressure from, the AP, that's a perfect example. So pressure from your goals, like I'm going to say maybe your goals, pressure from yourself that you put on yourself. Maybe there's pressure from a teacher or a coach, a classmate, or a family member to do well. Absolutely. I think these are right on the money. And whenever I talk with students, again, usually at the college level, but whenever I talk with students, this is exactly what they share with me too. It's that feeling underprepared, feeling like I don't have enough knowledge, or that's that stress, whatever the external pressure might be. So that external pressure of the AP exam, maybe a family member or a coach or a teacher, or even a classmate, or the pressure that you put on yourself, for sure. What are the forms of or the impacts of test stress? So if you have experienced it before, or if you have friends or family who have, so, does it impact your sleep? Does it make you procrastinate more because you're stressed and you want to just avoid it and forget about it? Does it make you feel more distracted? And I'll just pause a little bit to see if anybody has any thoughts. Yeah, procrastination. Okay. That's a common one. Procrastination is usually like the most common coping mechanism, I'll call it, with stress. So if we are stressed with a topic, we tend to just say, I'll do that later, because we don't want to put the mental or emotional energy towards it, Not being able to focus is another one, kind of along the lines of procrastination. So test stress is something that, even if you're thinking to yourself, well, I haven't really experienced it, it can manifest in a ton of different ways for students. And it can also, be during the exam too. So maybe, once you get into the exam, you thought you studied well, and then your mind just goes blank, right? I know I've been in that situation before, where you put in so much hard work, and then you sit down, you get through like 2 questions, and then you just don't remember anything else. Or maybe it's more of like that physical reaction. So, you're stressed out, your heart's beating. Maybe you're getting hot because you're really stressed out. Maybe you shake your leg or like click your pens. There's different physical manifestations of test stress as well, that can happen. Okay. Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate you engaging in this and sharing a little bit more. So with this topic of test stress, I want to share some things that you can do to kind of combat it, right? Or not necessarily combat it, but just ways that you can be mindful of it and be aware of it and work through it. So before the exam, making a study plan, surprise, surprise. So we just talked about that, but making a study plan can really allow you to feel more confident in that content and feel more prepared. Right. So the earlier you begin, and again, I say this like 3 to 5 days before the exam, and then you adjust that as needed. So some students feel more comfortable if you can a week or 2 weeks out. Other students are like, Julia, I can only do the night before right now. But setting a goal and saying, this is how much ahead of time I'd like to be studying. So that way I can space things out. That way you have time to ask for help. You have time to engage with a tutor, to cover topics that you might be a little fuzzy on. And so making that study plan ahead of time will really allow you to feel more confident in that knowledge, because you've also then had that time to ask your questions too. So reminding yourself of past successes. So that can be a really powerful tool. So before the test, to build some of that academic confidence, reminding yourself of previous exams or previous projects or previous tests that you've done super well on, or times when you thought that you weren't going to do that great and then you really did. And thinking about, okay, how did I prepare for that? Why did I end up doing well? And really critically thinking about, was it my study environment? Was it because I just had interest in the topic, right? There's some things in school where like the topic is actually going to be pretty interesting, and then other things where it's not going to be interesting at all, right? So it's a matter of thinking about how you can make topics interesting to yourself, and then how you can remind yourself about these past successes, and how can you then recreate those environments or recreate the reasons why you were successful last time. Completing practice tests to imitate test conditions. So again, it can alleviate some of that stress, because if you're nervous about, the uncertainty of, I don't know what the test is going to ask me, right? That's the biggest concern, is I don't really know what to expect from an exam. So if you're taking these practice tests, and you talk with your teachers, ask if there are practice tests available that they would recommend, or resources that they're aware of. Talk to your Upward Bound tutors to see, are there resources available that they're aware of that can help you practice some of these test conditions. And then rest your mind before the test. So this could be, 5 minutes before the test, or even the night before the test, making sure that you are, well rested if possible. And also just kind of check in with yourself. So I know I have this under the during category, so arrive early if possible and set up your workstation, but that actually kind of goes hand in hand with resting your mind before the test. So if you are taking a test in person, arriving to the classroom 3 minutes before, if you can. Just allow yourself to sit down, get situated, get, if you need pens and pencils out, whatever it may be. If you have, a water, making sure your water bottle is filled, using the restroom if you need to, whatever it might look like, making sure that you are like set and ready to go and ready to focus in. Okay, so that can be really helpful. As opposed to if you are like running in the door right while the bell rings and sitting down, you're going to already be in that panic state, right? So you want to make sure, just plan ahead a little bit before this test, or if it's an online exam, making sure that, you're sitting down ahead of time, you're signed in to whatever platforms you need to be signed into, and that you can really kind of just get started right when the test begins. Okay, so other things to think about during, taking a few deep breaths. All right, so I know it kind of sounds silly. A lot of times students are like, Julia, yes, I've heard about, the app Headspace, or I've heard about the Calm app, and I know deep breathing is helpful, that it's actually extremely helpful if our body is feeling stress. So if we are heightened and stressed out because we're nervous about an exam, usually we have some physiological symptoms. So maybe our heart is beating, as I mentioned, maybe we're feeling warm or flush. Maybe you are having a hard time catching your breath, whatever it might be. It's really important just to take a second, do some really good deep breaths. And this might be, a minute, right? You can do this before the exam or during the exam. If you're starting to feel yourself kind of panic, if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't remember anything, or if you're just getting into this headspace of you can feel like if you're running out of time, take the 30 seconds time to calm yourself and kind of recenter yourself with that breath, because controlled breathing will actually lower your heart rate, which can help lower all other physiological symptoms that you might be feeling. Okay. And heightened stress levels can actually create kind of a brain fog. So if we can decrease our stress, if we can in the moment take a couple deep breaths, bring our heart rate down, you can actually help to decrease that brain fog that you might be experiencing during the test itself. All right. And then the last thing on here is expect the unexpected. Okay, so very few students that I've worked with, probably very few students that I will ever work with, know the answer to every single question on an exam, right? So like you have to expect the unexpected and know that if you have a couple questions in a row that you do not know, or if you're like, I just cannot remember them right now, just know that that does not mean that you weren't prepared, but that it just was content that you didn't necessarily study. So it's kind of a mind game. You don't want to let these, couple questions impact your confidence for the rest of the exam. All right. So really thinking about, you're not going to know everything, and just try not to let that lessen your confidence. Okay. And then we have some test taking strategies. All right. I just wanted to check the chat, make sure we're still good. Okay. So a few different test taking strategies to chat about. So some of these you might be familiar with. Some of these you might be like, yeah, Julia, I do that, but really stop to think. Okay. So actively reading the directions or reading the entire question first before answering. Okay. This is one of the most simple things that I talk to students about. And usually they like raise an eyebrow at me and they say, Julia, seriously, I know, like, that's so simple. But a lot of people have the tendency to not actively read a question, especially if your stress levels are high. So taking the time, take a deep breath, read the question. And, when I say actively, I mean underline. So underline things that you think you're being asked of in the question, right? So if it's a word problem, or if it's like an essay problem or short answer, or whatever it might be, that there's multiple steps, underline the actions that you're asking, that are being asked of you to take. So what is actually being asked of you? And then circle any keywords, right? If there are keywords that you're like, ooh, that's actually a clue to me of like how I want to address the question, circle that word. So really actively engaging in the actual question itself can be really helpful. And doing that before, or the directions, doing that before you go to answer or before you start in on the questions themselves. Okay, so taking the time to actively read the directions or to actively read the entire question and all the answers. So if you're doing a multiple choice test, I'm talking to myself really, because I'm the person who like, I read answers A and B and I know it's B, so I just circle it and I don't even read answers, C, D, and E, or however many choices there are for you. So really actively reading all potential answers, just for the sake of it. Even if you're like, I already know the answer is A, make sure read all of the other options, so that way you can eliminate any answers that are absolutely wrong. Okay, and I'm going to talk more about that at the end. All right. So another way is using context clues from other questions. So typically, if you're taking an in-person exam, it's usually a hard copy. You can usually flip back, right, to previous pages or questions. If you're taking an online exam, sometimes it's not possible to go back to previous questions. So if you're taking the time to carefully read each question, it might actually help to kind of jog your memory in future questions, even if you can't go back, right? So even if like the testing site that you're on won't let you go back, or maybe your teacher has a policy, I don't know, where you can't flip the pages or whatever it might be. But if you do have the ability to go back and kind of reread questions, sometimes there's context clues from other questions or answers that you can really be optimizing. So thinking about that as you're moving your way through an exam. Being mindful of your time. So you want to be you don't want to just be so concerned about time that you end up distracting yourself or stressing yourself out more. So kind of setting some, I don't know, maybe mile markers, we'll call them, setting some little check-in points with yourself that, you know, if you are taking an exam and there's a clock in your classroom and you can say, okay, at, 20 minutes in or halfway through the exam, I want to be, halfway through the physical exam, halfway through the questions. And you can look to see, okay, how many questions are there? So about how long should I be spending on each question? Of course, that's not always going to happen. There's questions that might take a lot less time than you thought, and questions that might take a lot more time than you thought. But just being aware of your time can be helpful. You want to find a balance, and this might actually vary depending on the teacher and their specific exam style. Or the content itself, but you want to find a nice balance between, not rushing, right? Because you want to take your time, but also not spending so much time on specific questions that you end up not being able to finish the exam. So you really want to work with yourself and think ahead of how can I be mindful of my time and how can I best optimize that time that I do have. Okay. And then the last one is probably my favorite, because I know for me, if I'm stressed and I am starting to second guess myself or starting to feel overwhelmed, especially with multiple choice exams or things like that, you just eliminate the wrong answers immediately, right? So instead of looking for the right answer right away, flip the script and start to look for the absolute incorrect answers first. That can then allow you to start to, narrow down your options, and that can make it feel a little less stressful. And it can kind of focus in, right? It can focus in your attention a little bit more than being concerned about 5 options or however many 4 options that you might have, and then narrowing them down to 2 or 3. So that way you can make the best educated decision on which answer it is. Okay. And with this too, and it's not on the slide, but I will say all of these things actually kind of impact this last tip, which is coming back to tough questions. So there's different strategies out there that say, if you're having a really hard time with a question, put a star next to it. And if you can move on and you know that you can go back to answer it later, that's a nice way to do it. I usually like to say, do that within reason. So give yourself kind of like, it's kind of like the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? And you have your like different phone a friend or ask the audience. And so kind of consider you have 3 asterisks or 3 stars that you can put next to questions throughout the entire exam. So you want to use those 3 wisely. So if you get stuck on a question, okay, I can put a star next to it. I'm going to move on and I can come back to it. Maybe you limit yourself to just 1 or just 2. But making sure that you have that as an option to keep your momentum going, knowing that you do have the time and the ability to go back, but without then creating a situation where you have 5 or 6 or 7 questions that you skipped, and now you don't have a lot of time left and you have 6 of the most difficult questions left. right? So you want to start to kind of think about, okay, how can I give myself that little relief to keep my momentum going, and maybe have, those 2 stars. Okay, I can invest 2 stars in myself, and then keep going from there, right? All right, so just some things to keep in mind. Okay. So the last tip that I have for you all, and thank you so much for bearing with me. I know I throw a lot at you all, at the audience during my presentation. So hopefully, you're finding some of these things to be helpful. But my last tip for you all is asking for help. So identifying your support network, the Upward Bound team, the Upward Bound tutors, teachers, coaches, family, friends, really thinking about, who do I have in my corner that is here to help me? And that is going to be a key component to preparing for and doing well on the different exams that you have coming up. And then the last thing is all about asking for help. So how can you ask for help, right? It's an invitation for collaboration. And this is one thing that I like to teach my students that I work with, is clarifying and clearly identifying what it is that you're asking. So if you're talking with, the Upward Bound team, or an Upward Bound tutor, or if you're talking with your teachers, coming in and saying, I've been trying these strategies and I have not found much success in them. I'm hoping that we might be able to discuss new ways together, how I might be able to find success, because I'm really struggling on my own. Right. And so that way you're not saying, I need help, give me the answers. You're really looking at it as like, okay, this is a process. I want to learn, right? Like, I want to be invested. This is a collaborative process. So I would love for us to work on this together. And these are all the things that I've tried already. Do you have other things that I could be trying? So it's really all about how you go about asking for help, which can kind of yield different results. So going into it with this invitation for collaboration, I like to call it. So saying, I've already tried these strategies and they just have not been successful. Could we discuss other ways that you might have? And a lot of times, educators, teachers, your tutors are really going to appreciate knowing, what effort have you already put in and what has been successful. So that way they can really help tailor their other suggestions for you. So that way you can get the most help possible. Okay. All right. So as per usual, I usually run out of time at the end. So I always like to kind of give a little quiz. I'm not going to quiz you all, but I'll review. So the top 5 tips for, decreasing the stress, the test stress, and, increasing the quality of your study strategies are your study environment, your study strategies themselves. So thinking about the massed practice versus spaced practice, the Feynman technique, summarizing in your own words, some of those ones that we talked about. Test stress in general, test taking strategies, and then the 5th one is asking for help. All right. Okay. You guys made it through. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Thank you for your participation in the chat too. I'm actually going to pull up the chat just to make sure that I didn't miss anything. But if you have questions or feedback or anything that you'd like to pop in the chat, I welcome you to do so. But other than that, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate the opportunity.